Γεια χαρά σε όλους. Καλώς ήρθατε στο δεύτερο workshop για σήμερα. Ο μιλητής μας είναι ο Craig West. Θα μας μιλήσει για το WP REST API και τι μπορούμε να κάνουμε με αυτό, όντας ο καλύτερος μας φίλος. Hi, Craig.
Hello, everyone. I'll just say hi.
Yes. You can introduce yourself.
Thank you very much. I'll share my screen now, and then you can have the slides. We'll just check that we've got the slides and everything's visible for people.
Okay, I will hide myself.
And you can see the PowerPoint.
Yes, you can. We can see your PowerPoint, Craig.
Lovely. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining. And while I'm chatting, you can go to this website where all the resources and instructions are. If you're going to follow along and actually kind of work with your own local version of the site, make sure you have a fresh, clean install of WordPress, because I've got a backup clone that I'll walk you through and we can install it together as we proceed through this workshop. So the agenda really today is to understand what is this WordPress REST API and understand some of these terms like Ajax and JSON, how to use a little fetch API to get data when we're outside of WordPress or in it, but going to the back end to use the WordPress REST API. We'll look at endpoints that exist, how we can amend them, how we can create our own. And we'll use them for both getting data and for posting data. We will create forms in WordPress that can use these, and they will be secured with the WP Nonce for security. And we'll also start to see how we can use data and Ajax JSON from other sites, as well as exporting to outside, so that we can be part of the internet as a whole. And part of my inspiration for the WordPress REST API was this talk at a JavaScript conference in 2018, where they were talking about how would you put on one page Angular, React, Vue, each separate applications that communicate together. And the example I'm going to use later on is a one-stop shop for conferences, where when you pick a conference, you get the flight information, the booking, hotels for that city, but they're each from different applications, all communicating together on one page. So eventually it would be something like this, where there would be a page and different frameworks doing different services would be there. But as a WordPress developer, I kind of felt a little bit excluded from all of that. And considering WordPress is, well, this plus more share of the internet, I was interested, well, how could we use our content and capabilities in WordPress to be a part of this system, to provide service functionality to apps outside of WordPress? And the answer comes through using both the REST API and something called web components, custom HTML, which we can use. And so today, when we're looking at the REST API, I'm going to look at the REST API from a WordPress point of view. But we're also going to see how we will be able to interact with other frameworks, in frameworks or in applications that use other frameworks, so that we can actually supply information and service if we want to, and also be programmatically defined by them. Just before we start, a little bit about myself. I'm an old man. I'm 60, which seems like 200 years in terms of tech. And these were my first computers at school, the old paper tape and teletypewriter. I live in Brighton in the UK, just south of London. And I've had former careers as an accountant, SQL Server DBA, business information architect, and I've also been a proud plumber. So I've also included in this a link to a free course that's based on this workshop, but in much more detail. That's free, that you'll be able to have access to videos and codes for anything that you don't find you can understand in this workshop. And remember, in 90 minutes, there's a lot to get through. So there may be some things that I can't go into detail to explain. You might just have to take on trust and learn a little bit later. And when you download the pack on that website, all the details will be on there. For example, if I go into my site here, you'll be able to see the workshop site, the repo, which I'll go through in a minute, the course that you can have with a free code, and it's available for 2 or 3 days before it expires. So if you feel you don't get something now, that video series will help you. Now, there's something called 7 + 2. And our brains can only handle so much of information. So I understand when we do courses, because I do a lot of courses myself, that there's only so much one can hold through a course. So I'm very mindful of that. And if you feel too much, don't worry about it. That's perfectly natural. We all feel that. So the expectations for this course is that I know the challenge is what it's like to do something online. So view this workshop as an overview. And as developers, we know that some concepts take some time and effort to truly understand, and we do that after the workshop. But there's plenty of resources which I'm going through, and I'm a big fan of ready-made templates working. So as developers, we can chop them up, see how they work. So when I go into the installation and the download pack that we've got, you'll see everything's there that you need. You can just mull over what happens rather than trying to understand things in detail. You'll know where things are for later use. So we're going to take a sort of implementation first approach. We're going to use things a bit like jQuery, where we may not have fully understood it, but at a later point, you can go deeper. We're going to be talking about JavaScript, fetch, API, and promises, and these can be quite complex subjects when one first comes across them. But don't worry, we use one code snippet time and time again, literally 10 lines of JavaScript that does everything we need to do. So you don't have to worry about the JavaScript involved. Some concepts may be new. And remember, this is an overview to show you how all the parts fit together. When one understands that, then one can spend time because one has an understanding of the overall approach. I've supplied videos and text. And one thing the WordPress REST API will give us is the ability to do decoupled WordPress sites, because we now have many decoupled WordPress architectures, whether it's Netlify, Next, Frontity, and they all have to have data coming from the WordPress site, and that's the REST API. And it also means if you want, you can decouple the data from the view. But we're going to be working with the WordPress REST API within WordPress itself to have pages that don't need refreshing, that are truly client-side. I'm going to clear up a few terms before we start. What is REST? It's basically a style of transferring information across the internet, and actually HTTP is very RESTful. And it was something that was developed by a person for his thesis. It's a style rather than a protocol or a methodology. It is just literally some good guidance to help us. But we don't really need to understand REST per se. We just need to understand that if we go to a particular URL, we will get data. And the common term is endpoints. So this is an endpoint. And sometimes we do GET requests, POST requests, delete requests. This is the so-called verb. So you can have two endpoints because one of them may be a different verb. So you may say the same site, same URL in different versions, but we won't be doing that. Ajax is simply asynchronous JavaScript and XML. It should be JSON here, but out of respect to XML, they've kept it as Ajax rather than Ajax. And it enables us to read data from a web page without having to refresh the page. And we can do these things in the background. And this JSON is just JavaScript object notation. It's just key value pairs in a certain format. It's very lightweight, and it's the common standard now for a lot of applications. And it takes strings, booleans, numbers, null, objects, array, no functions. And essentially, it's like an array that we're passing from one site to another. So what we're going to go do now is we're going to download the resource pack, and I'm going to walk you through the installation of the site we're going to be using. So if I go to the site, and if you can't see this website here, let me know. Where it says repo here, let's click on that, and it's going to take me to here. All we need to do is click on code, download. I'm going to save it to my desktop. I'm going to extract it. And I'll go through all of this now. So what we're going to do now is we're going to actually install our WordPress site. And what I've done originally is actually got a site for myself. So a fresh install of WordPress. I'm going to go to I'm doing my own one here. You can see I've got a blank installation. I'm going to go to dashboard, and we need to install one plugin to start with. Go to install plugin, add new. And in that download pack, we'll see all in one, the latest version of this plugin, which I'm going to now install. I'm going to activate it. I'm going to go to all-in-one down here and import a file. And in that download pack, I'm going to click File and click this WordPress backup file here. Click on that. And that's going to load in. So starting with our WordPress REST installation, plugins, load in that all-in-one. Go down to here and select the backup file, and it's loading in. And once it's loaded, we'll have everything really we'll need with all the pages and all the GET requests for us here. And if there's any issues, let me know. Do stop me now if there's anything that's not working you're not sure about. Just going to do the final bit installation. Lovely, we're there. If I click on the site, this is what you should see. This is my demo site, Ajax. If I click on load posts, if you notice I'm not refreshing the page, I'm getting various script. If I click on this one won't get anything because I need a little script. It's not important, but if you want to do it, what one does is one goes into your WordPress admin and you go into PHP My Admin. This is my site here. This is my database. I'm going to go into this little script here, O1 turbo test. That'll open up, Control A, copy it all, back into here, the SQL tab. And if you don't do this, it doesn't matter. It's just one example. I'm going to run it. Now, when I go back to my site, where am I? Sorry, lost my screen. If I come back here and load, that's loading in a custom endpoint. And all that's happening here is we've just loaded in our own custom MySQL table, just to show the possibilities that we can use. So I'll pause here for a little moment. If there are any issues regarding the installation, the setup, you can see the site live by going, the one I'm going to be using. I'm going to be using this one here, wphtml.co.uk/Greece. One I've already settled, but it's exactly the same. So let's just have a quick look at the site to see what we will be making. For example, here we can see our just traditional blog post. The first page we've got, as we've seen before. Remember, we're not going to be refreshing. We're loading the 10 latest posts. We can load in some custom data. We can load in advanced custom fields. If we ever need to search, we'll be able to search for different things. Let's see if that something comes up with API. We'll be able to post data. And I've just put a little return value just for the demo purposes. If we go into home, we will now see that post has been added. But for greater security, we're going to be working with the WP Nonce. So I'll do test here. Send it. Notice how we don't have to refresh the page. I'm showing you what we'll be getting back just for the demo purposes. And if I go into home, you'll see those two comments or posts have been added. Now in the download pack, I have the manual, which is, firstly, we also have the slides, which we don't really need, but we also have this file here in PDF, which will be the manual that we can use that has all our notes. So I'm going to open that up, and here we are. When you've downloaded that, if you want to log in, there's an admin called Greece and WordCamp Greece 2021. And that's also available here in this little folder, admin tech. So you'll be able to log in and become an admin, and then you can play around with that site. Now, the hello world of the REST API is this. WP Greece is our site. WP JSON is sort of like the REST API space. WP v2 is a namespace. I'm going to go into that. And posts are the 10 latest posts. So I'm going to click on this. Now you may see something different. You may see this, whereas I see this. And that's because I've got this little Chrome extension, which is here, that if you want to go into this and install it, you can do that. Or you can copy into JSON Editor Online, which we're going to be using later, that if I go to that page, where is that information? Pardon me, I've lost. Let me just open that up again. If I copy all of this into here, copy it across, you'll be able to sort of see that we get all of that information in a different way. I personally prefer the Chrome extension. And if you close it up here, you'll see there are 10 items. A little word, there wasn't much on detailed REST API on YouTube, and these set of videos were very helpful, so I just wanted to give them credit because some of the more complex things for me, they managed to explain for me. We've been through the setup now. We should all have that site, but if not, you can look at the online one that we're working with. What I'd like to do is just show you what's in the site. So if I bring across my FileZilla, I've just installed this, and if we look at WP content, firstly in themes, I'm using a child theme from GeneratePress. And if you notice, we have these page-Ajax, page-Nonce. These are custom WordPress pages. And the way that works is if we go into the dashboard and into pages, we see, for example, that Ajax page, Ajax search. If we have a page with that name and call it page dash that name, that'll then respond to that permalink there. So we have a page called page dash Ajax. When we click on Greece/Ajax, it will take us to that custom page. And the only thing you have to check, which should be the case anyway, is that the permalinks are set with post name. So that's how we're wiring the site. Each of these, Ajax search, the post page, that'll be page-post here. If you look at plugins, I tend not for the REST API use plugins. WordPress allows us to use this folder called mu must use -plugins. And I put all my effectively my plugins here. And I open one up, you'll see it's just a set of functions. So we scroll up, they're just functions here, but anything in that mu plugins runs automatically. And the only way to stop it is to delete the file. It just gives me a greater sense that things won't be tampered by people. But you can make these into plugins if you want to and install them. We've seen the hello world of the REST API. And here it's a post ID with all the fields that one can obtain. There's the ID. Just to note, when we want the title of a post, it's title.rendered. It's a sub item, and I'm going to explain that more as we go along. We get the author, but we only get the ID. But if we scroll down, you can see I've got this field here, author name, Craig. And what we can do is we can add a field to any of the existing REST API endpoints. And if we scroll down further to an existing post, we can see the advanced custom fields that I have a special custom field there that can also be displayed. And to this end, what I'd just like to show you is in the plugins, for that to work, we not only need advanced custom fields, but we need this ACF to REST API one. And if we deactivate it, we wouldn't see that field. We've seen this URL or endpoint. In red, we've got is a site. WP JSON is the REST API, and it's a bit like WP-admin. We have WP-v2, which is the namespace, and the WP is reserved for WordPress, but we can use our own. I'm going to be using, for example, WordCamp. And we tend to have a version number as well for backward compatibility. You don't have to have it. You could just have WordCamp, but it's good practice to do this. And after this, this is the name of our root districts. So this is the REST API. So let's look at some of the things of data we can get back. And remember, we're going to be getting JSON data back. What I'd like to do is actually go into the pack and just show you what's in the pack and how we're going to use it. I've got some HTML demo pages, which I'll work through. We have all those plugins, like we saw that custom one. If you notice here, we see this field author name. This is how we can actually add that field to the standard REST API. On the post, author name, we'll go into that. But we can also create our own roots so that we get back the data that we want. All those pages that we saw have the code. And what we're going to do initially now is have a quick look at this very first page here. So I'm actually going to go into my folder, go into code, go into HTML and click on it. And notice this is the file protocol. We're not on any web server. If I open that up, notice how we get the 10 latest posts. Remember, those were the posts we just added. So straight away, this is almost an example of our first decoupled WordPress. We can display the data anywhere from WordPress using the REST API. If you right click and go to inspect, we're going to go into what's called the dev tools. When we open them up here, or you can do F12, there are many different ways, but right click and inspect is usually the way people do it. If I go into the console, we can see that this is the URL that we got our data from. Initially, what comes back is this. And if you look here, there's nothing in the body. It's a stream. What we had to do was convert it to JSON, and I'll show you the code shortly. But this now gives us an array of all those posts. And it's with that array that I've got that I can, using JavaScript, just display it on the page. So let's have a quick look at this page. And this page is important because when we understand this code snippet, it's really everything that we use all along here. Now, don't worry if you don't really get what a promise is or what JSON is. Just work with a code snippet for now. And later on, when you understand it a bit more or know how to change it, it'll all make greater sense. So this is the sort of the magic JavaScript code that brings that page to life. And if I go up, you can see it's a regular HTML page, got all the usual HTML, but at this point here, it's where we connect to the REST API. Firstly, we want to get to that URL. And if we click on that, if I open it up, we can see it's that same old data that we've been seeing before. Now we need to get that data. And I'm not going to explain the fetch API in full, but it's a bit like the Ajax, jQuery Ajax. It'll go to that URL, get the information. Then we need to check that we got a good response. And what we got back, if you remember, was that stream. Nothing really much of use is in there. So whatever we got back, the response that we got back And remember, if we go to that page, if you remember, we saw response, and that's the information here. When we get that back, we convert it to JSON. And now what we can do is sort of loop through that array and output the data. So let's have a look at that data. Notice we've got .title.rendered. And this will probably all seem, if you're not familiar with fetching data, this will seem maybe a bit too new and confusing. Don't worry about that. Just think of it as a library call to get some data and display it. When you work with the code, you'll be able to see how it all works. But if we look at this here and go back into here, we were just displaying the ID title and some detailed information here. So all we're really doing is looping through that array from 0 to 10, getting the title property, and the information is in the title.rendered. And we're going to be going over this code snippet time and time again. So each time it will make a little bit more sense. But for now, I just wanted to show how this page actually works. So when we were in our page here, I just clicked on that and we got this page. All it was doing was getting the data back, converting it to a JSON, and now we've got an array of those objects of all the information. So if there's anything that seems a bit troubling now, I'll pause for a little bit, but this code snippet basically shows how we can get data from the WordPress backend into JSON format that any site, anyone can use. And that's how headless WordPress works. Whether it's Next, React, it gets this data, and this is just a standard JavaScript array of data. It can process it and display whatever field it wants. And note when we had title, it was title.rendered. So just to recap this section, what we've done, we've installed WordPress clone, and we've started to look at what the REST API actually does. So let's have a look at some more of these endpoints, just so we get an idea about what all of this is. We've seen the standard one. If we click on this one here, notice how we get that table, that MySQL table that we imported in. And notice how I've got my own custom route, WordCamp v2 districts. Sometimes we get too much information back and we can filter it. It's a little bit small to see here, but if you look here, we have underscore fields and we can just select the fields we want. So when we come back here, I'm getting a much smaller set. So I'm getting an array, sort of arrays. It's JavaScript objects with properties of ID, a key value pair, the title, which isn't stored in titled, it is installed to title and then rendered, the author name, any advanced custom fields if we have them. The excerpt is also here. And if we scroll down to a slightly bigger post, we can see, for example, here we have more content. And that's how we can display REST API data in any page.
Greg, we have a question.
Sure.
Has the same logic if you to bring from another source WordPress?
From other sites?
Yes.
Yes, that's it exactly. One thing I'd like to show, you might think, well, we've seen how we can do WordPress within WordPress. What I'm interested in is how can we use WordPress elsewhere? And by that, I'm just going to go to this little demo here. If we look at that, we can see a standard post here. And I can change that with a button to a different post. But actually we're in an HTML page. And if I do Control Source and magnify, you'll see that all that on that page is just this web component. This is now WordPress in an HTML site, but rendering with UI and data. And this whole site here, one of the things we're going to just have a quick look at, but as we're talking about it now, if I wanted to display all the posts, for example, this is like a standard WordPress site. This too, we do Control U and open up. We can see all we're doing is adding a little JavaScript file and our own custom HTML. Now, if I go back to my PowerPoint slides, do you remember we saw this diagram? Web components are custom HTML, which are browser based, that we can store in PHP pages or Gutenberg blocks. There's some articles and videos of WordCamp talks on how to use web components in Gutenberg blocks. So you just drop them. But because web components are part of like the JS framework, remember when we saw this, how does Angular, React and Vue all work peacefully together? Well, the speaker was talking about these web components, and these web components could be put in an HTML page. They can also be bundled in with any framework. So what it means is we can put WordPress, its content, its services, and deploy them almost as what we call a micro app or microservice. So going back to this site here, for example, we also have like a blog. If we do the Control U again and look, we will see it's just two of these HTML components. It's regular HTML5. It's always been in the spec that we can just deploy this. So what it means is like when we're on here and a site wants to see like a new product, we can have a component for them that does everything with 2 lines of code. They just click and there it can display something new. And if we go into F12 just to see what's actually happening here, if we click, can you see this 9? I'm going to refresh the page. If I can turn that back to 106, you get a different post. When I clicked on this, all that was happening was we're just changing an attribute on here and it automatically re-renders part of the web component spec when implemented. So if I put 109, we can see it got refreshed. So we'll move away from this now, but this is why the WordPress REST API can be so powerful, because going back to our document here, we can see that while we have this was our eco center, we can actually pass data anywhere between different WordPress sites. And we can also make components that can be used as services in other apps. So let's go to all of this, and we've seen these different points. And remember this, if we remember this page here that we saw, this one. Now there's no reason why this can't be a different URL. This could be one of my other sites, a totally different WordPress site, that different WordPress sites could be just sharing information, because all they're doing is every site has, shall we say, this URL, this endpoint. We could get the 10 latest posts from another WordPress site and just display it like this. So there's no real boundaries anymore. And that's due to the WordPress REST API. So we'll just go back a little bit now. And this is, remember, a high-level overview of the WordPress REST API and how one would wire it, how the site that we've cloned, how we would see how it all works for when you want to work through it. But it's all working now, so you have the code and you can chop it up and play around with it to go into more detail. We've seen advanced custom fields. What I'd like to do is if we go into JSON Editor online, and what I'm going to do here is if we get from this point onwards, which is the site plus the REST API namespace, if we just copy that into the browser, pardon me, we'll paste it into the browser. We get all this information. Let's Control A and copy that into JSON Editor online. Let's copy that out, move it across, and you can see what we get is a list of all the different endpoints that we have. And this is not quite the format that I want for some reason. Let me just see what have I done. I'm going to close down some of these. Bear with me if you would. Here is all the data here. Let's copy that into I'm going to leave that for some reason that's not working now. Let's move on. So we've seen that we have all of these different endpoints that just produce different data. We've seen this one before that produces ID fields here. We can see if we come down here that, for example, if we have our own custom data in our MySQL tables, we can just produce whatever data we want. So now let's have a look at how did we make those site pages. So I'm going to go to the site. And notice we've seen our test posts. Again, we already seen this load post. We've seen how that code snippet worked. And that's exactly the same for literally almost any different table. And I'm going to show that now by going in here. And if we look at our different pages, we had our page Ajax. If we look in here, we can see that we're just getting access to different endpoints and doing exactly the same thing. This is the MySQL data. It's going, and in fact, here it's actually going to a different endpoint. It's going to a totally different WordPress site and pulling in that data there. And it's the same kind of code snippet. And for example, when we wanted that specialist data, it's exactly the same. We just change the path of where we're going. We're just picking a different URL. So with each of these pages, what we can see is that once we've understood this core template, which we saw on our very first HTML page, once we see fetching an Ajax request, converting it to JSON data, and then just looping through it and displaying it, we can really display information from any source without refreshing the page. Now, in the video series, I go into great detail about all of this with examples. Today, we're having a look at how does everything fit together. So when we come to things afterwards, we'll kind of it makes a little bit more sense. There's too much JavaScript and sort of concepts to kind of go through in detail in these 90 minutes. But we have all those video series that are available for you if you want to learn it in more detail. But you'll be able to chop up this code here and actually see how things work. So let's look at posting information, because this is how we've been getting data. How do we post information? Well, the first thing we might need to do is actually go and see this in action. So I'm going to go to the page and I'm going to go to the post page. And notice all we've got here is a slightly different endpoint. And we're going to look at the code shortly. But I'm going to add in something here. Test info. Send the form. We're getting a result back. And we've seen before how that now appears post test. Somebody's just posted up here, I think. Post test up here. There's the information, test info. Let's look at how that all works. Well, firstly, let's go to the page in WordPress itself. And if we scroll down, once again, we'll see that we'll come to a certain similar script. And without going into the JavaScript, we get the detail from the form, make a form object here, so we can send it to WordPress, and you'll see this more when we get to the other side. And if you notice here, we're doing another fetch, but this time we're posting the information. and we're sending off all that information, the title and the content that we had in that form, plus any other things that we may want to have hidden, any hidden fields. And we send that to our REST endpoint. So that's the page. We look in here, that's the page here. We're looking, I just have 2 fields visible, but I've got 1 hidden field so I can send extra information if I want to, like user ID or anything like that. When it goes through, that now comes to our first of our endpoints, and it's the REST-post. So what's important here is not to worry too much about the code itself, but just to know how the different pieces fit together. Then after the workshop, when you play around with it, you'll begin to see in detail what's going on. So if we click on this, we can add a new route, and it's an add action. Now this will feel a lot more comfortable for you because we're now into the WordPress PHP world. What we can do is we can register a new route, and remember how we use the namespace OWT/V1, the namespace, and our own route. I'm calling this REST-02. Remember in the page here, this is the route that we're posting the information to. We can get information from endpoints in the REST API. We can also post information to it. So when we're in here, we now basically have to do some standard WordPress REST API. It's in the handbook, but these are the examples here. Creatable means it's a post, as opposed to readable, it's a get. And we're sending over the title. We're saying it must be required, it's a string. We're doing a little bit of validation. These are optional, but we've included them. So it shows a little bit of server-side validation as well as front-end validation if we wanted it. And we're saying it's got to be more than 4 characters. And if it isn't, we send an error message back by return false. The title and the content, if we do this again, the title and the content. An extra token, if you send it across, I've hard-coded that in. When we've done that, once it's got that data, we need a callback. And we're going to use this function here, which I've just called REST-02_route. It can be anything. It's just this name here must tally with this name here. And this is boilerplate code out of the handbook. We get the parameters, we sanitize. I'm creating a little array with all these title, content, because I'm going to be posting it into the post. So publish, the author ID, the array. These could all be customized based on more information. But for now, I'm just putting it under my name and I'm putting it in category 4. I insert all of that and I return back some information. That's the information we saw below. Success, method. These are all custom. You don't have to put these in. I'm putting them in for demo purposes, the message, and I'm also sending the parameters that came with it. So now that we've seen that, let's go back and enter a new one. So test 5. If I click on it, notice I'm getting back the data that I wanted. Success, it was a method post, that was the endpoint, and this is what I sent. I sent title with the value of test 5, content with test 5, and a token that I just created on the page. I'll show you that. It's of no real importance. You don't have to do it. But if I wanted to send it some hidden information, I've done that there. So just to show you that, I'll go into page post, and I think at the top of the page, I just create a little object, local storage, JWT, a random number, which I store in local storage, which when I do my form at the bottom here, I get from local storage in the browser to return it. I don't need to do that. I could just put it in straight, but it's just to show you we can pass hidden information in a form. So I'll pause now. So if there are any questions, and while I'm doing that, ask questions, but I'll recap all the things we've done now, because what we need to do is just see how the different pieces fit on the page, not worry about each individual page in depth, what the code is. That when we work through it later, we'll understand more. But it's to demystify the WordPress REST API, because all we're really doing is getting back JSON data, that whenever we go to this URL, if we do it programmatically, we will just get back this content information, different forms depending on what route we use. So for example, I've created another one for like total users. I made my own route, WordCamp v2 total users, that we can actually get back the data, which we may want to display or not. So this is what the REST API does. It takes the MySQL database, and we can see that in the code that I tend to use. If we come in here, if we go into, for example here, I'm going into that table that we installed, and I'm selecting the ID and the unit name from that table that we imported into MySQL, and then I'm converting it into the right type of array of data. This is standard snippets that I got from the WordPress REST handbook, and basically add my class of WordPress REST response so that it's viewable by other sites, and I return it. And this response here contains this nice array of the ID and the name from that original table. Some others, for example, if we kind of go further down, where I've got something that gets the latest post by category, I'm actually using some of the built-in WordPress functions to actually get that data rather than accessing the tables directly. It's all standard, the W query, it's all standard WordPress PHP that we can use, because what we're doing is we're creating our own routes. This one's called WordCamp v2 is the namespace. The route is latest post, and I can add an ID here that when I do that and call back this latest post, I can get all that information returned to. And notice here, I didn't have to have any, I didn't pick out any parameters or anything like that. It was all able to pick it up through the REST endpoint, and I didn't need to do any validation, but I can do anything I want here and send back any sort of response I want. So we've covered an awful lot of ground. What we've covered today is, firstly, we've seen how we can access the WordPress REST API without having to refresh pages. We've seen how we can post information, and literally with a get and a post, that post could contain a hidden field like a delete or an update action, rather than actually having to send a different type of HTTP request. Between get and post, we can do whatever we want to do. And that data is now available for everyone, because we did see, for example, here, when we were first here, I'm on my own site, which is a folder. I'm literally on my desktop, and I can click on that and I can get all of that data. So this could be anyone else's site. It could be an Angular app, anything like that. And that's how these headless CMSs work. They basically connect to that URL. If you click here, they connect, they do a fetch request, and they convert it, and they get all the data they want. And then they can play it as they wish. We also saw that we were able to go one further if we wanted to, and that was actually give people a special little component. For example, this one here, a special HTML tag with a script file that if they put on the page, they can do whatever we've decided to do in this. And this can be a whole app. This can be any sort of functionality we want. Now, what I'd like to do is show a business example of that, because I've often thought, and I'm going to open up a new window, and if you just bear with me, I'm going to come into here, and I'm going to go into this here. Let me just run this. And this is one that I show at JavaScript conferences, so it's been put to a little bit of a test, as it were. Just load in. And the example is, well, how WordPress has a lot of useful content, a lot of useful information and services that can be available as a business service or for increased exposure by offering a service and having a little byline strap. So what I always thought is, what if we had a one-stop conference, that when you go and you look for a particular conference, that if you select one, that basically you could get your booking. It would then tell you the flights because it knows you're going to London. And because it's going to London, it also knows what might be some useful hotels or restaurants. And if you notice down below, I'm logging everything, but these are 4 different apps. And the example I give when I show this is, imagine it's booked. This is like a Vue app. This is a React app. Well, when we go to London, WordPress has so many useful sites that has information. Wouldn't it be great if we would got information from it? So if I go to Oslo, straight away it's changed. This component tells other apps, this person's going to Oslo. What are the flights from Oslo? What are the good restaurants? And if we look at the actual page for this, we will see that all we actually have here is 4 HTML custom web components. This was the one that found them. This was the booking component, could be React. This is another app that gives the flights. And here we have WordPress web component that basically picks up whatever is emitted once they pick a particular event and then filters for information that's relevant. It can be anything there. And just to have a quick look at what's involved in that here, just to show you, it's sort of not a lot of code, but it's doing a fetch. It's going to this endpoint. Once again, this is you can see here, this is a WordPress endpoint, getting things by a particular code and just displaying an information. Looks a bit like React, sort of based on React, this particular component, but it can be done in many different things, displaying all the information here. So going back to that example, from a business perspective, the WordPress REST API could allow us to give information to any other site. But how much better if in 2 lines of code, you can give them a ready-made component like a YouTube embed that's designed, all of that in mind, that just requires a certain field to be sent to it so that it can respond based on that particular code. And obviously you'd make the component depending on what the business use is. But this is the example of here. We have 4 different apps. We have 4 different components. And these web components are Vue apps, React apps that are exported as a web component so they can work in an HTML page and interact with other apps, sending data, events, so that they can all respond to each other. And this one at the bottom here, this event listener, this in the example is just what's going on down here. If you're having a central controller. So the way people could produce complex apps by just really combining HTML tags. So we're going to pause in a minute. The last thing I just want to show is how do we use the nonce for security? Because if we go back to the site, for example, somebody could, because we're sending information, they could do what they call cross-site forgery. How would we know they've come from our particular page? Because all we're doing here is sending data. And this is where the nonce comes in. Nonce means number used just the once. Some very good articles that I've listed here. But essentially what happens is we can create a nonce. For example, I'm calling it this. It can be any name we want. It creates that and saves it on the server under that name. And then we can what we can do is when we submit a page, we can pass that token, like we saw that hidden token, and check that it actually came from our site and not from a spurious site. So let's see that in action, because that'll make better sense when we're doing it. So we go to almost the same form as we saw in the post. The difference now is I'm using a different route, and we'll look at that. But if I do nonce test, and send it off, notice we get again some information sent back. And notice this one here. This is that special token that we've created on the site that gets sent. We can send it as a hidden field or as a header, which we see down here. And what we're going to do now is look to see, well, how do we get it at the other end and verify that the data came from this particular page? because this particular page has this unique ID that you could have been on this page to have got this ID and to have sent it with the information. So we'll go into here and we'll look at the page nonce. It's identical to what we've just been doing. The difference here is we start to create a token and we use the WP create nonce, and it must be this term here. This term here will mean that everything gets wired correctly. And I did a lot of testing with all of this. This is how it's told to be done in the developer handbook. If you use this code, it works. And what we do here, like we send a hidden field, we can send some hidden values in this form object. We can, for example, also session, we send that value to the back end. And remember, when we look at the page, we've created this token here. What we're doing is we're sending it along with our request to the server. So how do we get that? If we come back here, page post nonce, that needs this little plugin, or my MU plugin. It needs this endpoint to get it. So let's scroll to top. We're adding a new route. I'm calling it OWT/v1. Remember, we saw that. REST 03. We can see that's the route here. And we're sending over the title, content, a token, or some other useful bit of information. Now we send this, and it's got to be this with an underscore. That's the field we'll be looking for. Was that what gets sent? Because what we sent over along down here is we had to use that WP nonce here. You have to use this term and this term specifically for everything to wire properly. If you start making your own name, it may not work. So this works, and we've seen it work. So when we go back to that endpoint, we get this value. So like before, what we do is we get a list of those parameters that were sent in this post. We get the values, title, contact, some other data, the nonce, the session ID if we want. We sanitize it. And then what we can then do is verify that the value sent compared to what we stored in the server earlier on. Remember, we created that. That was the key term here. Remember, when we're up, we created this nonce called WP_REST. It now looks it up in the server, and it comes back that if they match, it says success. If it doesn't, it'll give you nonce fails. You can verify it. If you get a 0 back, it's failed. If it's 1, it's less than 12 hours old. If it's 2, it's between 12 and 24 hours old. These nonces tend to be valid for up to 24 hours, approximately speaking. And once we've verified it, we can then just insert it as we did before in the database. And I'm then returning some information from before. So let's have a look at that. We've done that. You see we've installed it here. Notice there's the nonce if we send it again. Did that work? Let me just refresh the page. Let's send something new. Test 2. There we go. That's all the information. We've sent it across. Test 2. If we now go into the home, there's the post. So this is how we secure posting information from within our own site. If you're working outside of WordPress and sending information, you tend to send over a token anyway based on that system. For example, what I will show you is if we were to do that, if we go back to our special HTML site, we can go to login, which if we look at control and inspect it, we can see it's another lovely little component, WP-login. If we come down here, I can type in, for example, to get validated. This is going back to the WordPress. Type it here. We can get back a special token if we wanted to. There we get a token. So what we can do is, even in our decoupled sites or in our components, if we want to post information, we can post the information quite securely because we can create special tokens that are based on the login to validate the user. Here we're creating our own token. In the WordPress ecosystem, we were using the nonce. So what I'm going to do now is pause, because that's been a run through of the overall view, and open up if we want to go through anything in particular or cover something again, because this is an awful lot of information. But bear in mind, we have plenty of resources for you. You have, if we click on this, you will see there is a course available, a very detailed course that you have a free coupon for, that covers all of the stuff we've got here. Setting up the project, that's the same site, bit of JavaScript for developers, fetch API, etc. The custom endpoints that we've worked with, creating endpoints for postage. It's all there with all the resources, etc. I'll pause there and let that sink in. Are there any questions or comments?
We have one question.
Yep.
Webhooks is the modern version of API, asked Stratos.
Yep. So what's the question?
Yeah, webhooks is the modern version of API.
It can be. The reason I'm doing it in a JavaScript way is because that's portable everywhere. If you're just in the WordPress ecosystem, you don't need to. You can use all the PHP functions to get curl or the webhooks to get that information if you're in it. The reason I've used this little snippet is because this explains how the REST API can go well beyond the WordPress, can go beyond really the whole internet. Because we could have a new metric, not just how many WordPress sites are there, but how many sites are there that use WordPress. Because all that valuable content that you have in your site could be a free or a premium service to other sites based on using the REST API and sort of say, so JavaScript, either is exporting data or in a kind of component, an HTML component. So yes, if that's inside, it's just accessing information within and getting JSON data. Does that answer the question?
Yes.
Good. I think so. Let's just quickly, let me go into Google WordPress web. Hooks. Yeah, that's calling a REST API. So yes, if you want to go like how to call a REST endpoint. Yep, if you want to do it, it's using effectively curl. So inside of WordPress, if you wanted to do that, if you wanted to do something that's available outside of WordPress, and that's why for that little code snippet, it's actually kind of worth getting used to JavaScript. I found it abhorrent to start with, but I've grown to like it. There's not a lot to do that same, and it's the same bit of code we see time and time again. All of these different pages. For example, when we were doing a search page, it's kind of the same. It's fetching, going to the post, query, search, adding what we're looking for, and it's the same code snippet. This sort of 10-line code or 5 lines of code, if you take out the console logs, does all of what we do on the site. So let's look at that site. And what we will see is if we wanted to search, this is how we're doing it here. We're just using this endpoint. You can tag on search equals and add the term here. So if I type in API, as we saw before, we can do that. So for example, if somebody, another site has this in a nice little component, they can get all the relevant information that they need, that you supply them. So in WordPress, you'd probably use the webhook. Outside of it, which is part of what we're doing here, we might use that JavaScript on the page to do all of that.
Great.
So let's just see. Yep. So I think that's webhooks. And I'm a little bit unknowledgeable about webhooks because I just tend to always use that JavaScript because I tend to work with JavaScript. But that's basically, you can, if we actually have a look at this example here, we can see that actually an array, the data title, get the title, it's putting all that information in. Because remember when we edited our field up top here, remember how we added the author name at the very top? We wanted to add an extra field into the WordPress REST API. We just used that function, get the author, and inserted it in. So of course you can actually do all of this sort of stuff with webhooks. If you want to just write it all in PHP, you can do. Nothing wrong with that. But it's all getting JSON data. And what's quite useful is for us to know how we can make our own endpoints. So what we've seen today is we've seen how we can get standard endpoints. We've seen how we can edit them. We've seen also how we could filter to just get the fields we wanted. We've seen how we could create our own unique fields, both for getting and for posting. And then, of course, those you would then use with webhooks. Now, this has been an awful lot from this point of view of understanding nonces, etc. But if we look at what we've got here, there's no way, I think if I was starting this, I would understand any of this first off. We've got our site in WordPress and we've seen how we can load in data. I've been using a bit of JavaScript, the fetch as opposed to the curl function, but we could load in the 10 latest posts as standard. We could even load custom data, advanced custom fields. We've had a lot of posts here that haven't been applied there, but you can see them down here. We've seen how we can search, and notice we don't refresh the page at all. And that's kind of one advantage. And notice how when we're getting all of these things, if we wanted to get data from other sites, we could also use that fetch request. We've seen the post, but secured with a nonce, so that we have a little bit of security. And that is the REST API. And the reason I called it Let's Become Best Friends with It, because I always come back to this in the slide. A sort of sense of, as WordPress, that we have lots of useful resources that other sites could programmatically import in. We saw that example of the conferences, that you're going to a London conference or you're going to Greece, say for the WordCamp in Athens. Well, it would be handy if that site that books you in with a flight could say, we recommend these hotels. This is from another WordPress site that has reviews, etc. It might be increased exposure for that WordPress site, or it could even be a paid service, or it could be processing information. Suddenly now, what we can do is find that WordPress doesn't need to have this wall anymore. It can be a micro app, just like any of the other frameworks or any other code systems, because it will use web components, which are all part of the HTML browser spec. And that's what I deem to be called effectively a WordPress HTML plugin, for want of a better word. So with all of that, we've gone through the expectations. We looked at the 7 plus or minus, been an awful lot today, but you now have a ready-made site using all these REST APIs. And in these examples here, you have the makings of your own headless WordPress site, because here we are, a page on my desktop. This is like a little desktop app that's using WordPress. So I'll pause there, and thank you for bearing with me. It's a lot to take in, lots of different bits of code, but I have ready-made examples for you that work, so you can actually look at it and see how it all fits together. And there's also that extensive video course, as well as the videos that I have on my channel that can explain different aspects as well. And I'm also available. You can always email me. I do love all this stuff, and I'm a big fan of the WordPress REST API. Thank you.
Great, Greg, you were brilliant, to be honest.
Thank you very much. Sort of, it's never quite the same as one prepares it, but that's part of doing it. And
we have 20 minutes, not 20, so we have 8 minutes. If anyone has
if you want to go over, if you want to go over anything again, I can just like clarify the wiring or explain anything a little bit more. We can certainly do that.
I don't see anything in the chat.
And there's no such thing as a stupid question. The only thing worse than a stupid question is a stupid mistake because we didn't ask the question.
That's true. We don't have any questions. Craig, do you want to let people know where we can find you?
Yep. If you go to that link on here, all the details, my email's at the bottom. If you go to that site, the downloads for everything are there. The clone for the course, the link, it expires around Sunday lunchtime. That's just the way it works. Completely free, goes through the WordPress REST API, slides, the workshop manual, the GitHub, everything's in this repo here. When we click on that, all of that information is in there. And to install, there's a video about how to install it too. Do enjoy it, and let's make WordPress 100% internet.
Great thought. We have one question from Ioannis.
Hello, Ioannis. Yes.
He's asked, do you have any examples of people using WordPress API for large projects in an interesting way? Perhaps payments or user authentication?
Well, all of these WordPress sites that you see next, or React or Frontity, I mean, Automatic, I think, purchased something in terms of Frontity. If we look for Frontity, that is all based on the REST API, the React framework for WordPress. And that's basically how you just connect. I think I'm right. I'm reading a post that Automatic bought a part of this. It's a React front end that connects to a WordPress. So all of these sites, and I think Pantheon was a big site that went over to headless. So if you ever search for kind of examples of headless WordPress, you'll probably find there are many different people using it. And remember, WooCommerce has its own REST API too. So all that, everything in WordPress can be done with the WordPress REST API. So for example, here are 7 inspiring hard examples out in the wild. All one needs to do is look at that. So yeah, they all use it. Thank you.
Great. I can't see any other questions.
Good. Well, enjoy the course and enjoy the information. And as was said by Matt years and years ago, learn JavaScript deeply. My own experience has been, I found it abhorrent, didn't like it at all. And as I started to use it, it seemed more natural. And as we've seen, we don't need to know an awful lot of JavaScript to actually be using it and displaying it. It's one small 10-line of code covers many examples, just varying it. So don't be put off by JavaScript. It's a very prominent language. And it's lovely to see WordPress and JavaScript and other frameworks all working together. So there's no longer that wall between WordPress and the rest of the internet. Thank you very much.
Great. Do you have time for one last question?
Yeah, I'm here, whatever.
Okay, great. Harris is asking, could we import live data from Excel Google Sheets to WordPress with the use of REST API?
Yep, because if we do this, remember this page here, this is just connecting, just making a call to a particular endpoint. So all websites that export data in terms of JSON data. So any site, so basically when we did this page, or when we were in sort of, for example, when we're in this page here, loading posts, loading this, they could all be, so long as this URL gives us JSON data, you can load any site, any information. And that's the basis of JSON data. It's universal data. It's how all the JS frameworks work. Everything is JSON data. It's not XML. So these could be data from a totally different WordPress site, or from a totally different site that supplies JSON data. And all these frameworks have what they call REST APIs that just basically export that information. And if we take this, and just to remind ourselves what this is, if we put this in here, this is JSON data. All Node, Angular, they work with that type of JSON format. So they could export it to you. You just say, give me the link. You'd get something like this, with that code snippet, how to display it, live updates, etc. And remember, that page is client side. So when we've been in here, you could basically not have to leave the page, and be doing like React or anything. This now can be a client-side app because it's all in here. All of these things are doing different things without having to leave the page and go back to the server. That's the great advantage of the REST API.
Great. I think we covered all the questions.
Thank you very much. Always feel free to email me. I'm really passionate about the subject, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Yeah.
Camp.
Thank you. Great.
Thank you very much for listening. Thank you all.
Okay. Με τους υπόλοιπους τα λέμε αύριο στο τελευταίο workshop. Καλή συνέχεια και ευχαριστούμε που παρακολουθήσατε το workshop αυτό. Επίσης υπάρχει το panel, αν θέλετε να κάνετε drop-in στο άλλο session, συνεχίζουν από εκεί. Καλή συνέχεια.